Last week, we looked at the new translation of the Mass, and we learned why we have a new translation, and we looked at some of the specifics of the changes, but in particular, we learned what these changes can teach us about the liturgy. This week, we're going to ask that same question, but specifically looking at music. And so we begin with a song at Mass that many take for granted. The general instruction teaches that our song throughout the communion procession expresses our unity of spirit by the unity of our voices. It gives evidence of our joy, and our singing makes the procession to communion truly an act of community rather than a lineup of private individuals. Therefore, music leaders must make every effort to ensure that everyone can sing during the procession. A minor complication for music leaders who might be accustomed to receiving communion before beginning the communion chant is the general instruction's insistence that our singing begin while the priest is taking communion. This apparent dilemma is easily overcome if the musicians approach for communion by taking turns in order to maintain strong leadership of the community's song. Furthermore, many communities that are served by a lone music minister have learned to carry on the song while their music minister receives near the end of procession. That was a scene from the teaching DVD titled The Celebration of Eucharist for the 21st Century, produced by Salt and Light Television for the Canadian Conference of Catholic Bishops. The DVD explains each part of the Mass, and of course it touches on music quite a bit. And joining me now to explore some of these questions about music are Father Bill Burke. He is the director of the National Liturgy Office of the Canadian Conference of Catholic Bishops. And with him is John Dawson. John is the composer of the Mass of the Holy Family, one of the 3 Mass settings that we're commissioned to use in Canada. So why is music important at Mass?
Because of that whole emphasis, especially in the revision of the general instruction of the Roman Missal, which tells us how to celebrate Mass, all through that, whenever it speaks of music, it doesn't speak of music as icing on the cake or decorative.
It's not an extra, yeah.
It's not an extra. It uses the word is integral to the celebration.
Right.
And we know that from our own experience in life in general. There are certain things that are communicated musically that cannot be communicated as effectively when they're simply spoken.
Right, because
you never recite happy birthday. It falls flat. And quite. And
that'd be funny.
Yeah, and actually in workshops I have done that to point out this.
That's a great example.
Because when they say music is integral to the celebration, it's not just adding greater solemnity, it's that dynamic that music has. And I'll use that as an example. I'll get to say, let's recite Happy Birthday to Mary over here. And they laugh because it's just so
it doesn't make
crazy.
Sense. Yeah.
And music has an ability to bond as well. There's a unitive function to music when our voices are raised in one. Go to a hockey game when they have a chant that's for their team. It's a unifying. So the general instruction is pretty clear. It's not decorative. It is integral to the celebration.
So when we look at this new translation, why do we require new musical settings?
At least my understanding with the original commission was part of it was, I guess pastoral would be the right word, in that in introducing the text to ensure that maybe it was a little bit easier, was that people might find it easier to learn these things if you sing them as opposed to reciting them.
Of course.
And then you also retain, like Father Bill was just saying, that integral nature of music. So if you're giving people something to sing, it's probably just setting a better precedent out of the gates for a new translation.
So again, just to back up, so there are 3 new musical settings and the chant.
And the chant.
How are those to be used?
You respect the authority of the local bishop, and different bishops have decided to use this in different ways. Our National Committee for Liturgical Music and our Episcopal Commission for Liturgy and the Sacraments, the 4 bishops on that, drew the conclusion that it was easier to teach the new text, as John said, associated with music. But then we commissioned these 3 texts not in the sense that nothing else can be used, but in the sense that in this first year...
Okay, and again for that unity.
Yes, so that across the country there would be some common repertoire of music.
Okay, because we received a comment from someone, and that was, and I think he was just confused, but he said, no, we can only use these three.
Well, I want to clarify.
In Canada.
No. I want to clarify. The local bishop has authority here, and because, it talks about music that is approved by the conference and by the bishop, and what some bishops have said, you can use any one of the four settings in Celebrate and Song.
Right.
But we would all ask every parish to learn one setting in common, so when we have diocesan celebrations, all can participate.
Okay.
Other bishops have said, we would like everyone to learn this particular setting, and other bishops have said, we'd like you to learn this setting. That doesn't mean that you can't use other settings from other composers.
Some have done composite settings, I think, as well, where they've even looked.
But the idea is that, for this first year, but eventually there might be new settings. There's 20 or more in the States.
They're already being sold. Yes, they're already available.
Right, they're already being sung, actually.
Yes.
I won't say what parish. Can you just clarify what this whole chant thing is? Is this a whole new Mass setting that's chant, or are we talking about the chants that the priest...
No. This chant...
Like the Lord be with you,
yes,
that chant.
That chant. With the exception of the Gloria in our chant setting in Celebrate and Song, these chants were prepared by the International Commission on English in the Liturgy. They had a subcommittee of 3 chant experts from around the world who are masters in Gregorian chant and who worked with the new text to develop this chant for the new text. In our Missal and in Celebrate and Song, we have taken these selections from International Commission on English in the Liturgy, with the exception of the Gloria. The Gloria was composed by someone who was also an expert in chant. Decision of the National Council on Liturgical Music that they felt this one was, for this first year of implementation, was an easier version to use for the Gloria.
But there's the chant equivalent to the other settings, so they can be used if a parish wants to do chant.
I know of one diocese that has asked
picked the chant
that
as
the
an
chant
option.
setting be the one for diocesan celebrations.
Okay. And as for some of the other parts that we're used to chanting, like the Lord be with you and with your spirit now, that is part of the chant, because you wouldn't have composed that part of the Mass.
I think, correct me if I'm wrong, but every aspect of the liturgy is sung. It's set. Even there's tones for the readings. It's a complete sung chant
so
liturgy.
The whole thing.
In the appendix of our Missal, you're going to see templates for people who wish to, presiders who wish to chant the
gospel. Chant or the preface, they chant it. Oh, the collect,
Even the readings.
Yeah.
If you notice in solemn celebrations, you can have the gospel chanted.
Yeah.
So in the appendix of the Missal, and this is not a Canadian edition, this came with the Missale Romanum, the Latin Editio Typica, and the translation from International Commission.
Yeah, from ICE.
Included these chant templates.
I see. Yeah, and like the exalted and all that, yes.
And you will find in the general instruction a real pushing and nudging to encourage presiders to chant more of the Masses. Mass text, especially on solemn occasions.
Right, okay, that makes sense. Can we look at maybe some specific examples? I know that opening clip that we showed looked at the communion hymn. And again, this is not a new part of the Mass. There's no major change there, but I think that because there's a new translation, the instructions, have also been revised. Are there any new revisions with regard to how music is used, or is it just a kind of a reminder, this is what it used to always be, let's go back to what it should be?
Actually, there are a few new points in the rubrics concerning music at Mass, but very few.
Okay.
In the revised general instruction, it's not so much that they're new rubrics, it's basically saying, we were asked to do this in 1975 and 1969.
And
we haven't done it yet.
So, for example, with the communion,
yes,
the rubric for communion, and the one that really sticks out for me is we sing up, and nobody does that.
Yeah, well, and
half the time you can't sing anyway because you don't know the words. But
there are several factors involved in this. In 1964, Romano Guardini, the great liturgist, wrote a letter to some colleagues about the reform of Vatican II, and one of the examples he used in terms of our understanding the liturgical act, is what he called it, was the nature of a procession. That a procession is not traveling music to get farther from the door to the altar. It's prayer.
Exactly. Yeah.
It's prayer in motion, in gesture, and he used a wonderful image that, for example, the entrance procession, if we could see it as Christ moving among his flock, gathering them in. And that icon. Well, when you come to communion, And together with the chant, I was very annoyed with some blogs that were saying that communion is the most private moment of our encounter with Jesus, and therefore we should approach in silence. That's not what the general instruction says. It says the communion chant has three purposes. That with the unity of our voices, we express our unity as the body of Christ.
Communion.
Community.
Yes.
And then it says it throws into the light, the Latin is, it throws into the light the communitarian nature of the procession. And then it expresses the joy and gratitude in our hearts. So it's not a private thing. Our faith is always personal. It's never private.
And singing,
we
I
are
guess,
the body
helps
of
with
Christ.
that.
I see that reflected a lot in my work in youth ministry. There is some kind of confusion between Eucharistic adoration and the communion rite.
Yeah.
And a lot of the music that is chosen
point.
can be very
Yeah.
adoration-centered. And some of it's beautiful music, that's fine. But is that the sole purpose of this?
Right. Although I think that
you
that
know?
somehow could work in the sense that they're easier refrains that everybody can join in
Could.
and sing.
It
So
could.
it could be
providing it respects the action, which is one of procession.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And
right.
the other thing that's interesting in the rubric, I believe it's paragraph 86 in the general instruction, and it says the communion chant is to begin as soon as
Yeah,
the priest
that's the other
receives
thing.
communion,
Yeah.
and is to continue until the last member of the assembly has received communion. It highlights the Unitarian function of the unifying function of this chant. And therefore, our liturgical musicians are saying, you don't sing 2 or 3 hymns. You pick one hymn, even if you have to repeat it and intersperse it with
instrumental.
And it should be the kind of music with refrains so that people can actually walk without carrying a book.
Yes, exactly.
I've heard psalms used a lot at that point too, and
Psalmody
that's
is
a really
very,
nice psalmody
very
at
common.
communion. I find that beautiful.
We just need to take a little break here. This is very good, but we're going to continue. It's a short break. Don't go anywhere. We're going to continue looking at some more specific Mass parts with regards to music. So stay tuned.
Let us know your perspective. Email us at perspectives@saltandlighttv.org or reach us by mail. Perspectives at Salt and Light Television, 114 Richmond Street East, Toronto, Ontario, M5C 1P1. Or call us toll free at 1-888-302-7181. Let your perspective be heard.
After kissing the altar and bowing before it, the priest leads us out into the world. Although a closing procession has generally become customary, the general instruction makes no further description of the departure of the ministers and the community. An informal departure, perhaps accompanied by instrumental music, is apparently envisioned.
Singing is neither prescribed nor forbidden. This moment is our physical movement outward toward the world and our ongoing journey toward the fullness of the kingdom. If there is singing, it should be well-known music, a general or seasonal hymn of praise and thanksgiving, or one that speaks of the Church's mission and journey. It should not be so long as to unduly hold us back. If there is instrumental music, it should have the character of a recessional, not a performance. Again, that was a scene from the teaching DVD titled The Celebration of Eucharist for the 21st Century. Again, that whole rubric, I guess, of the departure hymn or the closing hymn is something that no one knows, that there's no specific instruction that there should be or that there needs to be a song at the end.
No, in the general
Mass
instruction,
ends with...
in the general instruction, there is no provision for a recessional hymn. However,
but it's a procession, so in the sense of...
well, it's been a custom for a very long time. So we're not saying that you shouldn't do that. But for example, we've prepared pastoral guidelines from the Canadian Conference of Catholic Bishops for the implementation of the general instruction. And we make the point that although there's no provision for a recessional hymn, where it has been the custom, it can be continued, but make sure that you pick music that is of a missioning quality.
Okay.
Because that's what's happening here.
Sending forth,
you are being
yeah.
sent forth. Go forth, holy people of God, and to announce the good news.
Yeah.
And so...
And don't do 10 verses. Just do
And no,
2.
because you've already told people to go, and then you don't have them stay for another 15 minutes.
Yeah.
Yeah, can we look at some specific Mass parts, I guess? So starting with the Kyrie. This is the penitential rite. What is the purpose of the Kyrie? And again, I don't think, because sometimes, like I know your Mass, you didn't write a Kyrie.
No, there is a Kyrie, yeah. It's actually an unaccompanied Kyrie, and I'm not really sure why I did that, but it's very different than the rest of the setting. I just kind of wanted to write, maybe it's just me personally, I do tend to like a balance between accompanied and unaccompanied music.
Okay.
You know, in places like a Kyrie or maybe an Alleluia, just a very simple back and forth, you know, very simple acclamation. So the Kyrie was kind of an unaccompanied thing, and I think it's in there, is it?
Yes.
Okay,
Yeah, it is.
yeah.
Okay.
So what's the purpose of the Kyrie?
Well, it's part of the penitential act.
Should it
and
be sung?
It should be, but it's not all the time, perhaps, you know, if you don't have people. But as some of these settings of these various parts of the Mass become familiar, I know as a presider in parish for over 30 years, once people become familiar with them and you don't change them every week or every month, you don't need accompaniment. People can sing
Yeah,
these simple
exactly.
things,
Yeah.
and it adds to the prayerfulness of it. The purpose of the penitential act is to be aware, not to do an examination of conscience that we would in the sacrament of reconciliation, but to acknowledge that we have come as the sinners forgiven by God's love and mercy. And that leads beautifully then into that hymn of praise of the Gloria.
Yeah.
We are glorifying this
Okay.
God who has redeemed us from our sinfulness. And
So they go together in terms of a musical movement?
They don't have
they don't
to.
have
It's
to.
not two different
No,
parts.
Mine certainly don't.
No.
You know,
Okay.
but,
No,
yeah.
they don't have to, because you're definitely going to see an increase in the number of settings of the Gloria.
Right.
You know. But what the general instruction is very clear on here, we've had settings of the Gloria that were paraphrases of the hymn.
Right.
And when you paraphrase something, you change the meaning, whether you intend
Okay,
to or
so
not.
so the Gloria, it's not appropriate to use different words. It has to
Not
be the
permitted
words
at
that
all,
are there.
in the order in which they're printed.
Is it appropriate for it to have a refrain?
Well, that some people say no. We are preparing settings of sung through Glorias, but for this first year, we did these settings with the refrain in order to assist in the learning of the new text.
Yeah,
This was a
certainly-
pastoral approach. It wasn't a musical
Exactly.
preference.
As a
sorry,
composer, no, I was just say as a composer,
Yeah,
I
yeah.
thought the exact same thing. I recognize the fact that the Gloria doesn't really need a refrain. It is a complete text
Yeah,
as
it
it
starts
is.
and it ends.
Starts and it ends. But to me, it's the biggest change of all of them for the people.
Yes.
And it did seem like a bit of a concession, a pastoral concession, to say, well, at least you can sing this part.
So people
you
can
know,
learn the
yeah.
refrain, glory to God in the highest, and on earth peace, to people of goodwill. So
Yes.
that's the change, that's
Yeah.
the bigger change, and that's the refrain of your, I think that's the refrain of all
Yep.
three have the same refrain.
That's right.
Yeah,
Now,
I think
it's
we kept them pretty short and
That's
sweet,
the
too.
biggest textual change, but the big change in the Gloria is the restructuring of the phrases.
Yeah.
Yes.
That's-
yeah.
we
And
are
particularly
now-
that first verse.
That's
That, I mean,
exactly
you've made them
right.
into verses. So maybe this is a teaching point, so that because people throughout the year are going to get used to maybe a cantor singing the verses and they join into the refrain. According to the rubrics, that's not the way it should be. We should all sing the Gloria.
Well, no, the rubrics do allow for
Oh, they do?
alternating, yes, or responsorial style
so
of
they
But not
don't-
necessarily a refrain
not
verse.
necessarily a refrain.
Okay.
But you could do
Yeah.
one side of the. If you have a church a congregation that's accustomed to this, you would have one side sing the first
Yeah,
part,
yeah,
another.
yeah. Okay.
You know, you can those things.
I think that
can
was
be
the
developed.
confusion with the popularity of refrain glorias over the last little while. Is that idea of dialogue was
Okay.
sort of interpreted as verse-chorus model.
Okay. Now, are there other parts that are, I guess, intended, that are not intended to do as cantor? I mean, obviously the psalm is the cantor response. The gospel acclamation, everybody should sing together?
It's very clearly stated that there are parts of the Mass that belong to the entire assembly, and it's stated several times, and it cannot be taken from them. And the Holy Holy,
Like the
it's
signs,
very
yeah,
strongly
okay.
expressed. It cannot be taken from them. So musicians who really prefer polyphonic and SATP settings, that's fine when you have, but don't do it until you've got the assembly comfortable with singing
With
their
singing the
part.
melody, yeah.
Because the rule is quite stringent on that. It belongs to the assembly and cannot be taken from them.
Is that true for all the Eucharistic prayer parts? So the
acclamation,
acclamation,
the
the Lord
acclamations.
acclamation, and the great Amen, of course, is the
Yeah.
community's response.
Yeah.
What about the Lord's Prayer?
it recommends that, again, the Lord's Prayer be sung, but
It does recommend it.
well, I shouldn't say it recommends it. It certainly, that as many, especially on solemn occasions, that we sing as many of these things as possible with that degree of increasing solemnity. What I think we have to be careful with, I'm saying this from a pastoral perspective, having been in a parish for a long time. If you have a community that knows a setting of the Lord's Prayer and is comfortable singing it, by all means sing it. But in the instruction, for example, where it speaks of Gregorian chant having primacy of place and also polyphonic music, it then concludes that sentence with this very important phrase, providing the principle of full conscious active participation is respected. So if you decide you're doing a setting of the Lord's Prayer, regardless of what language is in,
that no one knows,
yeah, you're taking their prayer from them.
Yes.
And that disrespects the principle of full conscious active participation, exactly, which the general instruction reinforces.
Exactly. So it might be more beautiful, but if people, it's better for them to just pray the Lord's Prayer together rather than sing it. We need to end the discussion here, but there's so much, and I really encourage our viewers to find out more about the liturgy, find out why we do things. If you're a liturgical musician, I'm sure you already are finding out because that's your job. There's this great resource. I'm just going to lean over. And so the Celebrating Song, you probably already know about this. This is the resource that's been published here in Canada. It's got the 3 new Mass settings as well as a chant. And there's some other songs that have been added.
We took the opportunity to put in 40 new hymns because in the CBW3, one of the weaknesses is music for the Lenten season and for communion processional music.
Right.
So we've included that.
Okay, and don't be confused. It's called Celebrating Song, but this also has all the people's parts.
All the people's parts.
So you can use this as a resource at Mass until we get used to.
Plus Eucharistic prayers 1 to 4, so people can, not so much during Mass, but at home, or read through until they become more comfortable with the text.
Okay, good. And again, romanmissal.ca is the website, lots of resources, and cccv.ca. Just click on the National Liturgy Office link, and again, there's a ton of great resources there. So there's lots of homework. But we're going to continue, or I guess conclude our conversation by reflecting on this Sunday's Gospel. We always leave the last word to the one who is the Word. And so this is from Matthew chapter 22. When the Pharisees heard that he had silenced the Sadducees, they gathered together, and one of them, a lawyer, asked him a question to test him. Teacher, which commandment in the law is the greatest? He said to him, You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, and with all your soul, and with all your mind. This is the greatest and first commandment. And a second is like it. You shall love your neighbor as yourself. On these 2 commandments hang all the law and the prophets. So again, that's from Matthew chapter 22. John, let's start with you.
The funny thing, when you're dealing with liturgy, it seems to be a very intense issue for people. And I think we always have to remember that loving your neighbor as yourself, this makes me think of, to be honest with you, even 1 Corinthians, of the idea of that all the knowledge and all the noise, without love, it's nothing. I think that the dynamic of love I think it really needs to be remembered in a lot of these dialogues, because there's a lot of people have opinions, people have strong ideas, and that's great, but I think charity has to remain the rule there.
Yeah. Father Bill?
Whenever I hear that passage, I recall an incident with my mother when I had her in the car and I got stopped for speeding, and it was her fault that I was late, and I was rushing to do a funeral. And it was her fault that I was late, and I'm explaining to the Mountie that I'm late, and he is very nice, and he's going to let me off with a warning. And my mother leans over and says, He's telling the truth, officer. He has a funeral at 3, but he drives like this all the time. And I got the ticket. And the reason I mention that cute little story is because later she said to me, and I said, Why did you do that? And she said, Because I would never forgive myself if you had gotten into an accident and I had never spoken to you about fast driving. And that so much struck me. That's telling the truth in love. That didn't come from a critic. That didn't come from an enemy. So love is the greatest commandment. But love also involves telling the truth. It's not just warm, fuzzy, tender feelings all the time. Sometimes love requires great commitment and challenge.
Yeah. Well, thank you for that. Thank you for that. Thank you both. This, again, I hope it's been useful. It's been useful to me. Our 2 guests, John Dawson, composer of one of the new Canadian Mass settings, the Mass of the Holy Family, and Father Bill Burke. He's the director of the National Liturgy Office of the Canadian Conference of Catholic Bishops. The conversation might end here, but the discussion continues on Facebook, facebook.saltandlighttv.org. And remember, visit us at saltandlighttv.org/perspectives. That's where we post our question of the week, and we cannot do this show without your perspective. That's all for tonight. We'll see you next week.